Lizzie is an experienced research practitioner and as research director heads up Ipsos UK's transport and infrastructure team. Lizzie leads a team of social researchers and evaluation consultants delivering projects that aim to help their clients make better decisions for the future of our transport and infrastructure systems. Very much back by popular demand, with Lizzie having graced the ZC3 stage in 2023, the commute has remained a topic of interest for both Lizzie and Ipsos, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing how far along the road to zero carbon commuting we are. Lizzie, welcome.
Thank you very much. And you can hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. I'm really pleased to be following John on an absolutely fascinating presentation there. That's a hard act to follow with lots and lots of data and evidence, and I hope that I can do justice to complementing that by sharing more on public opinion and attitudes towards commuting, environmental issues and sustainably commuting. All of the data that I'm going to be sharing with you is from social research, largely survey research, so survey polls, which have been conducted by Ipsos over the last few months. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just to run through three key things that I'll be talking through today, and hopefully there's something here for everyone. So first up, we'll be looking at the kind of who, what, why, how many of commuting, very much building on the types of things that John said in his presentation, and also what do people actually think about their commute. Then we will move on to look at public attitudes to public transport specifically. Obviously, that is a really important part of the picture when it comes to low carbon commuting, but as we'll come to see, not everybody thinks positively of it everywhere in all parts of the country. And finally, I will move on to share attitudes to sustainable commuting specifically and what people think should be the priority for improving people's journeys to work. So next slide, please. Okay, what does commuting look like post-pandemic and what do the public think about it as well? Next slide. Well, nearly 9 in 10 of the UK's adult working population travel to their workplace at least once per week, and 38% are doing this at least 5 days a week. Just to say, these percentages are drawn from working adults as opposed to the whole UK adult population, just to clarify that. But if we go to the next slide, we can see how that breaks down a little more. So how many days are people actually travelling into work? You can see that the most common is actually to go in 5 days a week, quite a significant chunky figure there. So it's really important for us to remember that not everybody actually obviously can work from home. Of course not. There are some sectors in the economy where that just doesn't work, and some people are even travelling into work 6 or 7 days a week, and that might be people working multiple jobs and that type of thing. If we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, just to build on some of what we saw in the previous presentation, this is some analysis on the types of subgroups who are more likely than the sample average to be travelling into work more frequently and less frequently. So you can see the groups here: men, people aged 45 to 54, people in the rented sector, lower social grades, people in manual service and craft occupations with no children in the household and 2 cars in the household. They are particularly likely to be commuting 5 or more days a week. That doesn't mean, by the way, that women and younger people are not commuting frequently. It just means that these groups are particularly more likely than the average to be commuting this frequently. The next slide then looks at those who are more likely than the average to be travelling to work 3 or 4 days a week. And this is slightly different, more likely to be women, younger people, those living in London, in service and manual occupations, and those in part-time work. And the next slide then shows those more likely than the average to be travelling in 1 or 2 days a week. And that's slightly different again. So older people, owner-occupiers, people living in the southeast, in professional occupations, higher social grades, part-time workers, commuters and those with one car in the household. Within each coloured box, there is, of course, a lot of overlap between those groups. And as I say, it doesn't mean that people from other groups are not travelling at this frequency. These are just those who are overrepresented, if you like, in the data. And looking across the piece, I think it is interesting that the data from this self-reported survey shows that there is a socioeconomic dimension to commuting and who is travelling more often and less often, particularly when we look at things like social grade. So next slide, please. How are we getting to work and how do we actually find it? So that was lots of numbers about frequency of commuting, but what's the nature of the experience of commuting in the public's eyes? Next slide, please. So first of all, how are we getting there? Just completely echoing what was in John's presentation, the car unsurprisingly dominates the commute. So 55% of British working adults are using the car as their main way that they get to work. And that's much higher than public transport, active travel. And just to say, this is proportions of the population represented in a survey sample. It's not proportions of trips made. Some of the data that we've seen before is based on trip level data, but nonetheless, the picture is showing exactly the same thing. So unsurprisingly, as I say, the car is dominating there when it comes to commuting. Next slide then. How do we find it? We asked the public in a survey, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statements? And people in work who answered this question, just over 1 in 5 of them agreed that their commute is stressful. So that's a chunk of the population who are in work for whom the commute is not so great for them. Interestingly, 56% disagree with this statement. And among them, 26% are strongly disagreeing. So some people out there are having a great time in their commute, which is really heartening to see. But nonetheless, for 1 in 5 people, it's stressful. And I'm sure the presentations for the rest of the conference today will focus on the ways that commutes can be made better and indeed good for our health and our mental health and our well-being. Next slide, please. So my commute is a productive part of my day where I can spend the time usefully. 36% agreed with this statement, slightly more disagreed with it. But again, opinion is divided here. So it's not painting a totally positive or a totally negative picture of commuting. And in both statements there, quite chunky proportions are sitting on the fence in the middle. 21% in both are saying that they don't really have views either way on that. So again, a bit of potential for change there, which is encouraging. Next slide, please. Okay, so the most negative aspects of people's journeys to work, that's what this chart is showing. And poor road condition, the level of traffic congestion and the cost of travel come up as the top 3 things that people say are the most negative aspects of their commute to work. And that's, very much kind of reflecting the figure that we just saw on the number of people who are using the car. So they will be impacted by road condition and thinking about congestion and, of course, part of that congestion too. Environmental impact of my journeys, that's in there a bit lower down, but nonetheless, 1 in 10 people who have commuted in the last 4 weeks say that the environmental impact of their journey is among the most negative aspects of it. So I thought that was quite interesting. Next slide. Okay, just on the point about affordability, because we'll come back to this a bit later as well. We asked people, thinking about the amount that you spend on travel in 2025, has that increased, decreased, or stayed the same as your average monthly travel spend in 2024? And 45% of the public said that travel spend has increased. And just to say, we asked people to exclude their holiday travel spend, but this does include all other types of travel spend, not just commuting. And we asked the wider public this question. But for nearly half of British adults, travel spend in 2025 has increased compared to 2024. Then on the next slide then, just looking at those who said that their travel spend has increased, Just under a third of them said that that's easy to afford for them, but just over a third said that that is difficult to afford for them. And when we think back to who is commuting and how often they're doing it, and that socioeconomic dimension to that, I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind, because obviously your transport spend, it's a larger proportion of your income if you are a lower income individual. So these are important things to bear in mind, which we'll see play out later in what people think should be the priority for improving transport. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on then to the next section. So to what extent is public transport the answer? It's obviously a really important part of the picture, and we conducted a study of over 20,000 members of the UK public, where we asked them about the quality of public transport in their local area where they live. And just to say, this was a different study to the one that I've just presented. It was random probability sampled, if that's interesting to any survey sampling buffs out there, and it used something called multi-level regression and post-stratification modelling, MRP modelling. It's the same thing that's done for the exit poll. Hence, we have the map on the right-hand side there showing net satisfaction with public transport. We've modelled the results down to the lower tier local authority level. So the green areas are where net satisfaction is positive, above 0, and the red is where it's negative. Starting with the national overall picture, 38% of UK adults say that they are satisfied with the quality of public transport in their local area, compared with a very similar proportion who say that they are dissatisfied. So that leaves us with net satisfaction, the proportion who are satisfied minus those who are dissatisfied, at -2%. If we go to the next slide, please. We can see how these figures shift slightly when we start to filter and cut and slice the data. So it goes up from 38% to 42% who are satisfied when this survey data is filtered to those living in urban areas across the UK. But dissatisfaction increases when we look at those living in rural areas. Next slide, please. So, owing to those differences in rurality and urbanity across the UK, of course, when we look at the national level, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, we see those figures for net satisfaction differ quite considerably. So it goes down as low as -29% who are satisfied with the quality of public transport in their local area in Wales, compared with 1% in England, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to start with some of the lower, more negative scores, just to get that out of the way before we move on to the local authorities where net satisfaction is very positive. So I've picked out here some of the lowest net satisfaction scores, or the lowest scores for each of the nations. Scottish Highlands, completely unsurprisingly, -51% net satisfaction score for the quality of local public transport in the public's eyes. Compared to Pembrokeshire, -48%. Herefordshire in England, -42%, which brings me on to a fairly interesting point about rurality and remoteness, because of course these areas that I've just picked out from the data here are, some of them, very rural and very remote, but we also see quite low scores in some areas that aren't so remote. So if we go to, we'll come back to that in a couple of slides, but if we go on to the next slide, please. Great, here it is. So East Cambridgeshire and Somerset, for example, are not the most remote and rural local authorities across England, but they get really quite low scores. So there's a very dim view amongst the public about public transport there in those areas, compared to, say, Cornwall. You know, still net negative on public views of public transport, but Cornwall is a lot further out than these other places that I've picked out. So in some ways, I think that's kind of not so bad. And Great Yarmouth is again quite rural, quite remote, and it's got a net positive satisfaction satisfaction score of +10. So it's interesting to look at what's being done in these areas and what's kind of bringing up those scores slightly. Great Yarmouth has a bus network, lots of buses running. Cornwall has a transport app. It has demand responsive travel as well. So something is working in those areas, which is bringing the scores up compared to other parts of the countries where we may not necessarily expect them to be that low. If we move on to the next slide. So this slide, I've added in a map on the left, which shows the findings from a different question in the same survey study where we asked about housing. And I just thought that was interesting to look at, because obviously when we talk about commuting, we're talking about where people live and travelling from their homes to their workplace. So we asked the public in this survey how satisfied or dissatisfied they are with the amount of housing which is affordable to buy or rent locally. It's a really negative picture. So the overall net satisfaction for this is -47. 59% across the UK are dissatisfied. And actually not a single local authority had a net positive score for this. So if anyone's in any doubt that we have a housing crisis in the UK, well, it seems like the UK public aren't in any doubt about that. In some areas, we've obviously seen from the Labour government, we've seen house building targets double. And what we found when we looked across at the results from the map on the right-hand side, the satisfaction with the quality of local public transport, there are some areas where house building targets they've more than doubled. So we can expect commuters to be coming in and needing good transport links to get to work. But the views of public transport in those areas are very dim. So Doncaster, for example, has net satisfaction with local public transport at -25. Cumberland, for example, -35. So I just thought it was an interesting thing to consider, because when we talk about integrated transport, there's integration between modes, but there's integration between policies like transport and housing too, which is worth thinking of. Next slide, please. Okay, back to the positive areas. So which parts of the country, which local authorities have the highest levels of public satisfaction with public transport there? Perhaps unsurprisingly, London comes out top, and 32 of its boroughs are in the top 40 local authorities in the UK in terms of public attitudes of public transport. Wandsworth, Merton and Bromley are the highest. Also really positive opinions amongst the public about public transport in Nottingham and in Manchester, which, like London, also have integrated public transport systems. Nice that Edinburgh scores so high as well, and that might be related to it having a tram system, for example. Next slide. Okay, a little more on subgroups, because we looked at subgroups at the start. Among the most likely to be satisfied with local public transport are younger people and older people. That might be related to the types of discounted fares on buses for older people and on rail for younger people. We don't really know the full why when we look at survey data. Among the most likely to be dissatisfied, you can see these groups on the right-hand side here. And just to point to two of them, people who are not working due to long-term health conditions and caring responsibilities. This is interesting to note because both of those groups have been focused on in the government's white paper for getting people into work. The idea is to support these people to get into work, but at the moment they are among the most likely to be dissatisfied with public transport. So these people need the links to be there, and they need them to work for them to be convinced by that. Next slide, please. Okay, for our final section then, what do the public think about sustainable commuting and what are their priorities? Next slide. Let's start by zooming out a little bit and looking at public attitudes to climate change, because that might be one reason why people might be concerned about commuting sustainably. It's obviously not the only reason, but for many it's in amongst the mixed. And concern about climate change is at 72% at the moment. It's usually around that level. It has been high 60s. It's gone up 8 percentage points since 2022. On the right-hand side, the results show the responses to the survey question: if individuals like me do not act now to combat climate change, we'll be failing future generations. And we asked people to what extent they agree or disagree with that. And the percentage who agree has actually fallen over the last few years. So next slide, please. Okay, we also asked people in a separate survey study to what extent do you agree or disagree that it's important to you that you personally travel to work in an environmentally friendly way? And people, rather encouragingly, are more likely to agree with that than to disagree. And there is a large chunk of people sitting on the fence in the middle, which I think is interesting because these are people who perhaps could have their opinion changed. They could be the ones that could be swayed when we think about attitudinal shifts and behaviour change. Next slide, please. If we compare this to this statement, which is people should be able to travel to work using whatever transport mode, regardless of its environmental impact, the public are actually more likely to agree with this statement than the statement above it. And this is to some extent reflecting a sense that people still do want choice. And we see this kind of personal freedom and choice argument coming out in lots of different research that we do at Ipsos about travel and transport, and the appetite among the public for still being able to choose how we travel is strong. And of course, there are lots of choices that can be made. There are lots of choices and options on offer for sustaining commuting, for commuting sustainably. So we sort of want to avoid debates that lead to binary discussions of using the car or not using the car, because that very much plays into a war against the motorist narrative. And we can see that there is appetite for choice. Next slide, please. Finally, then, what are people's priorities when it comes to improving people's journeys to work in Britain? No surprises that affordability of public transport comes up top, and then followed by potholes, more reliable journeys, more frequent public transport services. This is reflecting the types of transport that people are using already to a large extent, making it easier to travel in more environmentally friendly ways. That's in there, that's in the mix. It's not at the top, but 13% say that they think that that should be given highest priority to improve people's journeys to work in Britain. So finally then, if we go to the next slide. Thank you. What have we learned from this data? Well, obviously the commute isn't dead, but it is car dominated, as we know, and not everyone is having a great experience of it. We've seen that work travel has socioeconomic dimensions. That means that approaches to improve it could too. And if we think back to those subgroups who are traveling to work more frequently, I think it's not just about the proportion of the population that we can reach with improved commutes, it's the proportion of the trips that are made, because as we know, some people are commuting much more frequently than other people are. So the reach and the potential for improving commutes is substantial. Public transport has to be part of the picture for that, and by and large opinions of public transport are very positive in urban areas where there are integrated public transport systems, but where public transport provision isn't so good, of course that does carry through and is reflected in public opinion, and that would be difficult to shift as well. Affordability is a major concern, and I think it's important to focus not just on actual affordability but perceived affordability. The example of the increase to the bus fare cap is quite a good one to think of there, where the actual bus fares weren't increasing, it was the cap that was reported to be increasing, but then that caused a bit of public confusion, and so a perception that it's getting more expensive to travel on the bus, which wasn't. It's more complicated than that. That wasn't necessarily true. So perceived affordability is important to focus on. As we've seen from the previous slide, people value choice and they have lots of different priorities. There's not one clear silver bullet winning priority for the public, although we saw things that were at the top of the chart and affordability was in amongst them. People want lots of different things, so the solutions, there needs to be a plurality of solutions. The solutions need to be diverse and meet those different priorities too, and that won't just be public transport, it will be shared travel, ride sharing, of course, micro-mobility, demand-responsive versions of transport, and in rural areas, for people who can do this, switching to electric vehicles. It has to also be part of the mix, because of course improving public transport everywhere in all parts of the country, that just isn't really feasible or practical. And finally then, as we've seen from the figures, not everyone is convinced by the idea of sustainable commuting and its importance. It isn't a top priority to absolutely everybody. But we saw in the attitudinal data that there are large proportions who sit in the middle of the response scale, and they say, I don't really have any views either way. So that middle ground, I think, is quite an important portion of the public to target. So people who are already very positive about sustainable commuting are probably doing it. People who are negative about it might be really tough nuts to crack. But when you've got a chunk of people in the middle, that's ripe opportunity for shifting opinion and behaviour. So finally then, just to say thank you very much for listening, and hopefully some of what I've shared can set you up nicely for the rest of the talks that are to come for the conference today.